Get this streaming. There we go. All right. Hey, everyone. Corey DeVos here. And thanks for joining us for yet another episode of The Ken Show. I'm joined, as always, by my very good friend and mentor, Ken Wilbur. Ken, how you doing, man?
Good, Patty. Great to see you.
Good. Yeah, it's great to see you. You know, just before the show, we were talking about just how awesome last month's episode was, where we went through the major and minor scales of your integral politics model.
Right.
And man, I mean, we spent 3.5 hours unpacking that. And, you know, I just find that I'm thinking about it every day. I'm still unpacking it throughout the month. And, you know, I'm the type of person who consumes a lot of political news. And it is amazing how helpful that discussion was for me. You know, there's so many things, so many sort of takeaways, I think, that I and hopefully our viewers, you know, had around that piece.
Right.
You know, for one, I think it was such an incredible interpretive frame that really helps us make better sense of, you know, where we're at today and where we've been and where we might actually be able to go from here, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Helps me see how these, you know, sort of political and governmental dynamics are actually playing themselves out in real time. You know, and I think more than anything, it's helped me sort of resist my own kind of slide into one kind of tribalism or another, just by, you know, simply acknowledging that there really is no such thing as a monolithic left over there and a monolithic right over there. I mean, these are all, you know, again, broad coalitions of different views and values that are all sort of vying for control of our major political parties. And I think that, you know, the conversation that we had just really helps us expand our vocabulary a bit, see a few things that we weren't really able to notice before, and hopefully will help, you know, these kinds of conversations actually, you know, find just a little bit more traction in this world. And because it's, you know, becoming increasingly clear to me, Ken, that this world really needs these conversations. So I was thinking today, yeah, we would basically pick up where we left off last month, continue the discussion. We did such a great job of sort of getting all the pieces on the chessboard. Now we get to actually move those pieces around and, you know, have a little bit of fun together.
Right.
And before we, you know, started with the big questions, I thought maybe we would spend a little time and actually talk about, you know, what is sort of the current condition of the chessboard itself. So, you know, I was thinking maybe we could do basically like a quick reality check. I just want to see if, you know, you see what I see, because, you know, what I see, Ken, is this really, really rapid emergence of what's basically an entire new set of life conditions, a new set of, you know, global challenges and realities that have never existed before. And I think that these changing life conditions are what's really demanding an integral response and integral solutions and new sort of integral strategies of self-organization. You know, as we often say, actually anything less than integral at this point in the game is really just going to make things worse.
Yeah.
It's going to be partial solutions that create, you know, an even bigger mess. You know, and in terms of these life conditions, you know, I see it just everywhere. I see it all around us, really in all four quadrants. You know, there's the ticking time bomb of climate change, and we've been getting a lot of really scary reports coming out in recent weeks, being like, guys, hey, you know, you've got 10 years to figure this out, maybe, if we're lucky, to do, you know, basically a moonshot type, you know, set of solutions to help mitigate the damage that we're inflicting to our climate and therefore to our, you know, long-term sustainability on this planet. There's the prevalence of plutocracy and, you know, this historically significant, historically huge wealth inequality that we're struggling with right now. We've got, you know, things that we've discussed in previous episodes. We've got the rise of social media and the polarization and the balkanization of culture that's come out of that. We've got this sort of systemic regression towards things like nationalism and populism that we're seeing all throughout the West. We're seeing this epistemic collapse of the post-truth world, the violent inflammation of all, first tier stages, which is itself a result of, kind of a total breakdown of the developmental conveyor belt, which is, resulting in even larger, wider, deeper gaps and divisions between all of us. And when I sort of list it all out like that, it sounds really daunting and even a little bit depressing. And I think it is daunting and it is depressing. But at the same time, it's we've been talking about this years, and in so many ways, this is all kind of arriving right on schedule, right? And I think more importantly, what it means is that I think the stage is actually being set for integral ideas and integral solutions to begin actually finding, again, some real traction in the world in a way that we've never really, been able to see in the past. I think human beings, we've proven to ourselves time and time again just how terrible we are at seeing the problem and coming up with a proactive set of solutions to try to mitigate the problem. We're really bad at that. But what we're good at, what we're really, really good at is adapting. Whenever our realities and our life conditions just change from underneath our feet, we adapt. And we find these new patterns of self-organization that are more efficient, more sustainable, just better in most ways than what we had before. But it's like you need the challenge in order to for that to really begin to emerge and hit sort of the tipping point that we really want to see these things eventually hit. And I think it's interesting because it's not like, how do I want to say this? These developmental stages, they often come before the world really needs them, right? I mean, we've had integral thinkers like yourself for the last 40 years, doing your work. And, in a lot of ways, you've been a pioneer and you've been sort of laying down this groundwork before these life conditions, I think, really started manifesting in as powerful of a way as they are today. So in a lot of ways, you're ahead of your time. And in certain ways, you're, again, sort of right on schedule. But this has been true, all throughout. It's, the first postmodern thinkers didn't emerge, in the 1960s. They emerged in the early 20th century and, enjoyed a status that Roger Walsh called a cognitive minority. In a lot of ways, I think that's the same status that, us integralists have been enjoying for the last couple of decades. We've been a cognitive minority, but I kind of get the sense that things could change, pretty quickly and pretty radically in sort of the decades to come. And another really interesting thing about these life conditions as they're presenting themselves today is I think there's something going on here that's a little bit unprecedented historically. And that is, all the previous stages as they emerged, they were largely emerging in reaction to the disasters of the previous stage. So, green emerged in response to, the disasters of orange, and orange emerged in response to the disasters of amber, and sort of, on it goes. I think that with integral, it's actually taking shape a little bit differently. It seems to me anyway, I'm curious to know what you think about this, but it seems to me that, it's because it's the first stage that actually acknowledges and wants to include all of these previous stages. The integral stage itself is emerging out of sort of the entire spiral, or rather, out of the collapse of the entire spiral. So it's a little bit, integral is not pushing against green, it's pushing against sort of these massive gaps that are opening up between all of these developmental levels. That's where sort of the integral roots, I think, can be found. And it's those roots that, when this actually does come into its fullest expression, I think it's these roots that exist in these gaps between us that's actually going to start weaving things back together, allowing us to weave the world back together in a certain kind of sense. So it seems to me that, all across the spiral and all four quadrants, we've got these accelerating life conditions. And I think that these life conditions really form sort of the overall context for today's call, as well as all of the conversations that we've been having. It's why you and I have been doing this. It's why we do the work that we do to bring integral into the world. And I think it's, you know, it's why it's not only such a scary time to be alive right now, but also a really, really exciting time. And so I'm wondering, Ken, you know, basically, do you see what I see? Are these? Do you agree with sort of my assessment of how integral is really emerging out of not just, you know, this sort of layer of pathologies that we're seeing developmentally, but out of this entire, you know, kind of breakdown of the spiral itself?
And keep in mind that it's sort of one of the standard things to do when we worry about what's happening tomorrow is we focus on all of these negative things, and you can really pile them up. And integral, in a sense, gives you a large number of tools to find even more things going wrong. You know, more dimensions that people don't take into account, and you go, oh, well, you think that's bad, look at this thing. So that can start to become pretty overwhelming when you do that. But you and I have also talked about the fact that there's a type of revolution occurring in all four quadrants. And although you can never tell which way innovations go, the assumption is at least some of them are headed in very, very positive ways. And so if we look in the upper right quadrant, just the work that's been done on genomics, for example, I mean, we are very close to wipe out genetic illnesses entirely. There's already a renegade Chinese scientist that's used CRISPR, the gene editing technology, to actually change a human zygote, put it in a human being who's going to have that child and start reproducing that edited gene. The entire world is alarmed by that, but that's the direction that we're going, and that could have enormous positive consequences. One of the things that it's very likely going to do is increase average lifespan well into the hundreds. One of the things that I've always said is, well, if that actually happens, first of all, I figure out how to pay for it. But second of all, what would people actually end up doing? I mean, even if you retired at 80, what would you do for the next 80 years? I mean, you've only lived half your life. And sort of one of the utopian ideas about that is, well, one of the few areas that people could explore that they hadn't explored before was their own interior developmental awakening and states of enlightenment, metamorphosis, satori, moksha, etc. And so people would actually have the time, and they might not be bored senseless for other stuff they can do. So they are pursuing that. If we look at what's happening with robotics, if we look at what's happening with artificial intelligence itself, we're almost certainly headed quickly towards augmented humans. And that's going to change things profoundly. And one of the things it's going to depend upon whether this change is positive and in a positive feedback loop, or whether it gets in a really negative feedback loop and drives us right into the ground. But part of the idea is going to be, okay, we have this augmented reality and we can plug directly into the entire internet, the entire cloud, and have all of that information available to us in our own awareness anytime we want it. So the question at that point really does become, okay, what values do society set on those types of information? And that's one of the things that an integral approach can help with doing, because it acknowledges pretty much all values, but it also sets them in a framework where they're oriented to each other, and you can actually see certain priorities. And priorities with, like, say, developmental stages, it's always in one direction. It's towards more inclusion, more diversity, more perspectives. It's never the other way. The higher you go in a growth hierarchy, it's not the more people you oppress, it's the people you include. And each higher stage on the growth hierarchy includes more perspectives and more people. Whereas on dominator hierarchies, each higher stage you go, the more people you can oppress and dominate and all that. And unfortunately, most postmodernists have confused those two and thrown them both out. And so that's a disaster. But these types of profound changes in augmented humanity are coming. They're coming in the upper right quadrant. It's going to be a profound sort of type of revolution. Again, not to mention just the actual physiology of continuing cell growth, so that our lifespan really does start to get to be 100, 200, 300 years. And we have no idea what to do with that. In the lower right quadrant, Kurzweil's overall singularity. I mean, that's coming this way, whether you agree with exactly Kurzweil's version of it or not. Technological innovation does continue to proceed at an exponential rate. So it's only a matter of time before absolutely off the wall, outrageous types of learning machines start to come into being. And again, the best thing we can do with that is use it to augment humanity and not simply start supplanting or even replacing humanity, which are, as you know, a fair number of technologists think will happen. As one put it, the first time that we create a super intelligent machine, that will be the last thing that we create. But given the sort of positiveness of what can happen in the lower right quadrant in terms of what a truly enhanced artificial intelligence could bring, we're also in an unfortunate transition where, for a very large percentage of people, particularly in the lower middle class to middle class, technology has displaced an enormous number of jobs right now. We expect at some point it will start creating new types of jobs, but we're between those two worlds right now. And one study even showed that over the last 20 years or so, about 80% of jobs that were lost due to automation. So this is hurting. But it's still, on balance, has to be counted as at least having some sort of potential positive contributions that we're not really quite sure of right now. In the lower left, the idea is that we are slowly moving towards, certainly in the developed countries, stages of cultural development that are starting to push into integral second tier. And that's going to be a cultural singularity. That's going to be a cultural transformation, the likes of which we've never seen, ever. And so that's the way. Latest estimates put it that it could happen roughly as soon, that is to say that getting a 10% tipping point at second tier can happen roughly about the same time that the technological singularity is supposed to occur. So somewhere around 2040, 2050, we could see both of these things happening. And that would be a change in the cultural lower left meaning systems and a change in the techno-economic infrastructure occurring at the same time, along with the continuing gains in the upper right. So this could start to be really stunning. And in the upper left, we have this increasing understanding and desire also of types of awareness that move into both second tier in growing up, and an increasing awareness at some degree of the fact that we also have things like waking up, and those are very important. So all of these factors are on the table with all of these negative factors.
Yep.
And part of the difficulty, I mean, as you point out, humans don't have a very good history of seeing a problem coming and then addressing it so that they ward off the problem. Almost always they see the problem coming, they wait, the problem hits and devastates them, and then they build their way out of the mess. I used to joke and say the only guy in history who actually fixed the problem before it was Noah. He actually saw the thing coming, actually built the solution and survived. The only time I've ever heard humanity doing that. So we're not good at that. It does suggest that we, of all these positives and then negatives, that it most likely, not necessarily, but most likely might be something bad happening on the negative side of the street that forces some sort of organization of what we're doing. And all of this is indeed in the backdrop of a civilization that, however we define it, is in some ways becoming more and more global.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it wasn't really that long ago before we even started talking about something like the global village. It was like, wow, that was really happening. And that was news to a lot of people. It really been 30 or 40 years when we've started to actually think in those kinds of terms. But happening is, as we pointed out last time, we do have this economic system that, as it increasingly becomes transnational, deals across borders, starts to take on seriously global dimensions. Whereas virtually all of the regulators that we have are at level of nation state or even earlier. And so we're having a really difficult time coming up with ways that any form of government can regulate what's going on globally. So we have things like the United Nations and so on, and they attempt to try, but everybody realizes that's a pretty really hobbled system. It runs into the standard problem that you get when you look at today's thought leaders or the essential sort of cultural leaders. An enormous number of them are at green. And again, it's a broken green. So, I mean, even that language has been adopted by the terrorists. I mean, terrorists talk boomeritis. It's like, oh, we're doing this for our freedom. We're doing this for our self-expression. We're doing this because we're being true to ourselves. And that they'll have a better chance in the press during talking something like that. And so it worked. I mean, the press still has, if you say anything bad about an Islamic terrorist, anything, then you have Islamophobia and you're a racist. So it's bizarre in terms of how that's turning out. But you raise this whole issue about couldn't integral be responding to the whole spiral in terms of deficits along the whole thing. And that's certainly the case. And at the same time, one of the problems is that whatever the acknowledged leading edge is supposed to be, then it should be operating to mitigate some of those problems. And for any number of complex reasons, and not just Green's, but with Green being at the leading edge of cultural evolution for about 5 decades now, they have to assume, you have to take a special look at that, you have to assume a special responsibility for that. Just as at the previous stage when Orange was the leading edge, it had to assume a type of responsibility for some of the nasty things occurred there.
Right.
Everything seriously increasing industrial pollution, even missile crisis. I mean, those were all, to some degree, to kind of the whole developmental sequence falling apart, but it was due especially to the way that the leading edge itself handled it. That's what leading edges are supposed to do.
Right.
In any evolutionary system, I mean, you see a little plant being born, and there's always a growing tip. And that growing tip is always trying to find ways, if it's like a seed that's planted under a pavement, everybody's seen, seedlings pushing up through pavements. But that's what growing tips do. And that's why Maslow referred to self-actualizing people as the growing tip of humanity, that they were pushing forward into ways that have more freedom, more liberty, more fullness, more potentials, more capacities. And that just is kind of an endless unfolding. Nobody's saying, oh, well, whatever stage we're at, the highest stage there is. No, that's not it at all. But there is this increasing inclusiveness, increasing diversity in the true sense of the word. And that's what each of the leading edges are supposed to do. And then when we get up to the leading edge of Green, one of the main problems that Green itself has is it's sometimes referred to as a pluralistic stage. Claire Graves, of course, called it a relativistic stage. And relativism is a nightmare for a leading edge, because it really can't make that it can commit to. And so nothing but a series of really bad performative self-predictions result from something like that. And so we really have been kind of set loose in a worldwide cultural atmosphere that doesn't have an assurance about certain very central values that it should be following. And so it proclaims all of them are egalitarian, and therefore all cultures are equal or multicultural. And there are no values in general that are better than any other values. And that's how they get by default at egalitarianism. The problem with that is that Green stage itself, when it says that all values need to be treated the same, itself means that that's the one correct way to look at things.
Right.
And so it has the one correct value when it says that all other values are equal, but it's really saying this value is superior in a world where nothing is supposed to be superior. So that leaves it wide open to just an enormous number of contradictory, conflict-ridden, and in particular, confusing signals on how to go forward. And I'll come back to that. But in terms of what that does as a leading edge, is it leaves essentially all of the earlier stages without a real coherent growing tip. They don't have any really morphogenetic field coming down from on top and just nudging them in the essentially correct direction. And so what you get is runaway amber ethnocentric. What you get is runaway amber well, let me preface it by saying, because you're talking about the problems with the market system worldwide and the difficulties that it creates. One of the major ways that orange actually divides the world up. Amber divides the world into saints and sinners. Orange divides the world into winners and losers. And then green divides the world into sensitive and insensitive. And the problem with orange, because the market system worldwide is essentially an orange value structure. And the main value that it has embedded in it is winner versus loser. And so that's one of the, if you look at any of the sort of major criticisms about capitalism or something like that, is that it inculcates that type of intensely competitive winner versus loser mentality. And the problem then becomes that because that market system is global, again, we don't have any regulatory capacities that can actually get in there and help smooth things out. And so one of the problems is that if any country wants to introduce something, let's just about global warming, if one particular country wants to introduce real significant changes in its carbon footprint so that it either massively taxes it or other sort of punitive actions on that, including business, then what happens is that that country, although it can be considered noble, it immediately becomes less effective in the world marketplace. And a year or two later, it's going to be dead, basically, through no fault of its own. It's trying to do something noble. And so we don't have a system set up well that when one nation state does something that is good for the commons, but will hurt it economically, it's discouraged from even doing that. And in many cases won't. So even with the Paris Accords, where everybody, all the countries in the world except 2 signed up for that. And now the vast majority of them aren't anywhere near the goals that they promised. And then look at Paris and Macron's increasing the gas tax to help drive non-fossil fuel types of energy and to help pay for the creation of green energy. And they have the worst riots of anybody since probably 1968. I mean, it's really getting kind of crazy. So part of the difficulty is we have this global market driven by winning versus losing mentalities. And the problem is, and we'll talk a little bit about this more later in terms of what we can actually do, but the problem is how can you tend to limit that without completely crushing the dynamism that does have some secondary positive benefits, as we talked about in really just the last couple decades. Overall percentage of poverty on planet Earth, which in 1895 was about 95% of the population. And in 2015, it's officially less than 10%.
Wow.
That is the most stunningly positive thing
Yep.
happened to humanity in its history.
Yep.
It's unheard of what happened. And how that went down in the last 2 decades.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have all of these positive factors going on. And then we have all of these negative factors. And the point in any event is that none of those can be as understood as they can be if you use an integral framework. And we were talking about politics. Well, if you actually look at what's going on in politics, then it can become very enlightening and very useful and really sort of spur ideas about how to take that forward.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to have to see, and some of the changes that we can talk about certainly include technological changes. And we talked about augmented human beings. Or even keep talking about eventually coming upon a way that the human brain could just directly communicate with computer systems. And when that happens, that could dramatically change everything. But again, the question is, what type of value system are we going to hold that information in? And one of the main value systems that we have is the one provided by evolution. And that shows up in human beings as development. And the thing about development is, just as evolution itself went from atoms to molecules to cells to organisms, just kept getting more and more unified, more and more whole, more and more inclusive. That's what stages of human development do. And that simply becomes increasingly one of the most central and important issues that human beings have to take into account when they select a set of values that they want to carry forward. Because that is a choice. We're doing that. We've made choices based on the full AQUIL framework. We've certainly made choices based on which basic level of development are we coming from. Each of those has very different value systems, but we want to be able to take those into account. And particularly where we see, for example, that each higher stage adds a perspective that a human being can take. So they really do go from very egocentric or me-oriented to more ethnocentric or us-oriented, but it's still just my group versus all those other groups, until you get up to world-centric, and then it's a care and concern for all people, for all groups, for all tribes. It's a very simple but a absolutely central notion. Because again, let's say if you're having a world federation and there is some sort of titular head or president or CEO of it, however that might be selected, would you want that person to have a 3rd grade education or a 12th grade education? Probably at least 12th grade, hopefully a little bit higher.
Yeah.
We don't get up asking as a questions. They make perfect sense to us. But again, strangely, somehow, in most developed countries, by the time you get to 18 and you've gone through 12 stages of increasing understanding and growth and development, and then all of a sudden you hit 12th grade, somewhere around age 17 or 18, and then absolutely everybody from that period on up is the same. No differences, nobody keeps growing, nobody keeps becoming more expansive and more inclusive and capable of embracing more diversity. We just stop. And then everybody is simply assumed to be exactly the same stage of inclusiveness or diversity, and they're not. And the problem with things like social justice warriors is that they understand the importance of these values like diversity and inclusion, but they don't see and they deny the stages of development that got their values in the first place.
That's right.
And so they're not helping, and they've actually hurt because they've denied all hierarchies entirely. And they don't see that growth hierarchies actually drive towards more diversity and more inclusivity. And dominator hierarchies do the opposite. Those are bad. But the only people that use dominator hierarchies are people at low stages of growth hierarchies. And people at high stages of growth hierarchies, they all condemn dominator hierarchies. So by tossing both of these out, you've tossed out the solution to dominator hierarchies. You simply have no way to get rid of them.
Right.
There's no understanding of the stages that lead to these things. So that is where even the entire spiral that's inflamed, and particularly you have things like sort of kind of leaving out the whole Midwest population of this country, as the elites on the coast sort of made the choices, and then this whole massive rebellion jumped up and voted in Trump because they were just completely being overlooked in terms of what these higher values are doing. And nobody was addressing that issue. And frankly, we've done that so poor. I think we're lucky that we didn't get somebody much worse than Trump.
Who would that be?
We were really asking for it. So we had that issue. And then one of the real problems, because if you look at all the positives in all four quadrants, you look at all the negatives in all four quadrants, one of the things that comes up, particularly given this sort of massively overrun global economic orange winner or loser system, that's also just kind of run rampant, and we're still trying to figure out ways to make that fairer without completely disrupting the whole thing. But it does come down to some sort of world federation or something that has a genuine capacity to oversee items that are occurring on a global scale. And that would include watching out for the global commons, watching out for global financial systems, watching out for global peacekeeping. And that always means basically cops. You have to have cops. And so that kind of thing would make a huge difference if, for example, we had that kind of system in place when Muammar Gaddafi was in power, or Saddam Hussein was in power. And when they were demonstrably, it's like Saddam Hussein was demonstrably gassing his own citizens, then that global police force would look at all the evidence, run it through checks and balances, and then arrest the son of a bitch. I mean, just as it is now, we have to leave it up to kind of, okay, one country chooses to go in and do something. We had in the whole Bosnia conflict, there was a whole discussion about we do this because it's just based on humanitarian grounds, and et cetera, et cetera. And all of that is being done in a very piecemeal, catch-as-catch-can fashion right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then too often, in some cases, it has more political than humanitarian motives. And those are rarely good on their own. So that's a real problem. One of the very major issues about anything like a world federation is, particularly as the world continues to grow towards a value that is generally called democratic. So once we have this kind of democratic situation in place, the larger the number of human individuals that are truly educated on these issues, that know something about these issues, then it's common to say, will get the government they deserve. It's going to be true on a world federation. I mean, it's, we have 7 billion plus people. And where are they in an overall educated understanding of what's going on? And what's true in both undeveloped countries and developed countries is we have this problem of how individuals psychologically create their own identity. And what we don't know, it starts out certainly in these egocentric stages, which just an individual concerned about their own being and their own survival and that kind of thing. And then their identity can expand into more ethnocentric stages. So identify with their family or clan or even tribe. As that expands, they can sometimes feel a sense of unity in their identity, kind of work community. They start to hear about these things like, well, what state are they in? So they might sort of develop, I'm a Texan, I'm from Arkansas, whatever that is. And then there's this whole thing called America and the United States. And then been for most people in the past, there's an expansion of identity to include the country that you're in. And then there's the next step, that whether it happens in 1 or 2 or 3 steps or whatever, but it goes from country to global village.
Right.
In order for a world federation to actually work, there has to be at least something like a majority of people worldwide that identify with a global entity that this World Federation is going to govern. Because if they feel that it's just being forced on them and they don't want anything to do with it, they don't want to support it in any way, then it's going to be really impossible to get politicians moving up to that level that will start to argue in favor of what their own countrymen don't want. That's a good way to do it. So this is always coming back to just how much consciousness and culture continue to develop, because it's those higher degrees of development that become ever more inclusive. And it's looking pretty sure that, again, with at least a majority of people on the planet being open to a world federation, and a vast majority of them right now not being anywhere near stages that want that, 60 to 70 ethnocentric or lower.
Yep.
So that starts to be a truly deep and inherent problem that almost all of the people that I've heard talk about some global governance have never really to understand. And in part because developmental studies just aren't really understood very well by almost any authority. Right. But it's a central issue. I mean, how are we going to be able to help people grow, develop in their own capacity for ever broader and wider and more inclusive and more diverse types of identity.
Right.
And if that doesn't happen, then we've got a real fundamental glitch in this issue. And that's something that has to be put on the front burner. We can't run off and find tons of new technology. We can't just run off and make some sort of fiat. And then a little bit later on, we'll also talk about some of the real difficulties. One of the difficulties at just the most fundamental level. But then we have the whole difficulty of how do we transfer a worldwide government system where several nation states have most of the power, and how do we get them to surrender some of that power and give it away? That has never happened in history, anything like it. And so that's a real issue. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in a little bit. But one of the things, talking about that individual ingredient that has to show some sort of embrace of this larger idea. Two areas that fundamentally have the biggest chance of affecting an individual's overall growth. And there are others, but there are two in particular. One is the education system. Now, what happened there was that in the 1950s, the center of gravity of education in Western culture was a orange orientation. It believed in rationality, in scientific values. It believed in the humanities. And Claire Graves called it multiplicity because it took a lot of different multipliers into account. Still tended to think science was the best way to get truth, but it was open to all of these other perspectives. And that's one of the reasons this sort of embrace of a large number of perspectives, the reasons that was the stage that finally outlawed slavery in every major rational industrial country on the face of the planet, was because of that. It was actually taking the role of the slave and saying, I'm not so sure I would like to have that happen to me. Mm-hmm. Why do I keep doing it to these other nice people? But every major culture up to that point had slavery. So with it. So this was a big move to get up to that particular stage of development. And then with the emergence of green, then that went, Claire Graves called that relativistic. So it wasn't even multiplistic. Now you have all these multiple perspectives, plus they're all relative. And so that means none of them are better than any of the others. That means egalitarian, and that means equal outcome. Everything has to be the same. So in any sports game, everybody gets the same participation model. There are no winners or losers because green hates orange and orange believes in winners and losers. So green is dedicated to having no winners and losers. Everybody finishes finish line at the same time. And that, of course, it can be a bit disastrous. Right. Part of the requirement for individuals to actually be able to continue their growth and development is for the education system itself to become open to these increasing waves of unfolding. Again, they already do it, first grade, second grade, up to 12th grade, already done. So I don't think this would be that horribly painful a way to go. And one of the things that we did see that was sort of good news, bad news about green is that, as I was saying, in roughly 1950s, early 1960s, the education system in Western countries was founded on orange. And so it had very high standards for sciences. It had a broad approach to the humanities and the importance of a liberal arts education, and so on. And then starting in the 1960s, because the leading edge of individual development started to become green, because green had just emerged. And so the very brightest, best and brightest started moving into green. And by the time they got into universities, they brought that main value set with them. And they really managed to remake the university system, all of its humanities, pretty much top to bottom. And it, among other things, became a really far left orientation. Not even a healthy left, but a quite far left orientation. In 1950, the ratio of conservative to liberal professors was about 4-1. By 2015, it was well over 20-1. So people like Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Haidt will say there just are no conservatives in the social sciences anywhere. And just as a prejudice, that's not good. But what it did show is that a specific value system like green can actually step in to our educational system and completely change it.
Right.
And so that at least is a possibility. So as some of the best and brightest start moving into one of the really common responses when people first are introduced to a generally integral view, and especially if they are themselves starting to move into those stages, they get very excited. They get very turned on. They have aha moments. They go, it makes sense now. This is all clear. I love it. So one of the things that we're looking for is the same kind of leading edge thinkers taking things like integral and starting to move those into the educational system. And we're starting to see, small outbreaks of this. And there have been a lot of books written on integral education. There's always nowadays at least one or two people in almost every branch of a humanities department that knows about integral approaches. And so that's at least one area but education really ought to be a crucial component of whatever's going to happen. So one of the things that anybody can do, and we'll come back to this, is take any step you can take to address any educational institution that you're involved with, and just start the process of getting some of these ideas more well-known and hopefully accepted in whatever the educational system that you're working with. The other major institutional area that have a really profound impact on this, on a culture-wide scale, is indeed the standard traditional Christian religion. and in particular, the notion of a conveyor belt. I had, and we talked about this before, but it was a very interesting meeting with about 20 or 30 of the leading evangelical teachers in the country. And a mutual friend said, you know, I know all of these teachers, and almost all of them have read your stuff. And they want to know if they can, you know, come out and talk. And I said, well, sure. So all 20 or 30 of them showed up. We spent all day talking. I'm curious why they were interested in an integral approach to spirituality. And because I had a really unfair stereotype about evangelicals, which was that they were all sort of fundamentalist, and they all believed the Bible 100% was the God. And so my question for them that I had to really soften up, but the question was, yeah, this is a horrible thing to say, but it was like, you guys aren't smart enough to be interested in integral. What are you doing interested in integral? Because I had them, I pictured them out there teaching that Moses really did part the Red Sea and Lot's wife really did turn into a pillar of salt. And how can you think that and be interested in something as kind of complicated as integral? And actually, I just came to the very neutral way of question, and I asked them all, and it was fascinating. They all gave really good responses, but the one that was moving was almost the last person that spoke, and it was almost a whisper, but the person said, we're sick of the myths. And in other words, exactly those things that I was thinking of, Moses parting the Red Sea and being born of a biological, and Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt. They were tired of having to believe that as dogmatic truth. They didn't buy it. They were embarrassed having to teach that to intelligent, educated Americans. And so when they read integral and said, well, wow, you don't have to do that with spirituality at all. These are some of the lowest stages of growing up, the magic and mythic, but just beyond that, not to mention waking up. So that was very interesting to me. But it does go to point out that given that worldwide, some 90% population has some sort of belief in those sorts of mythic, literal religious orientations. And even in America, it's 60 to 70% has that kind of belief. It's probably the largest single area of belief systems that both need the most change and in some ways are open to that kind of change. Mm. And so I think that's an incredibly important aspect that we have to keep in mind as we go forward. There's also just across the board, and I will come back to this, but in addressing all of these issues, it really is important that we are touching bases with things like growing up and waking up and cleaning up and showing up. Mm-hmm. I was talking with a very, very bright guy a week ago who's working on worldwide global changes that can help these overall processes that we're talking about. The question was, what was it that he was running up against that was causing the most problems in terms of getting some of their ideas implemented. And he said, which is driving right to my point, he said, oh, it was getting their interiors aligned in a certain kind of cooperation because the technology was just there and they could jump on it one way or another with any set of values they wanted. But as long as they were just sort of trying to ace each other out and shove each other out of the way and keep that sort of winner loser type of mentality, nothing was happening. So his group had actually started a program that first takes very high-powered individual leaders and CEOs and presidents and all of that and puts them through courses and exercises and trainings that can help them adopt a cooperative and collaborative viewpoint. Whether they have that much success in doing it or not remains seen, because that's part of the whole problem. And part of that does indeed depend upon general stages of development that a person is at. But these are clearly becoming a central part of the overall changes that we see, and particularly in any of the ways that we want to alter those changes, in no matter what quadrant they're happening, and whether they're positive or negative. One of the major problems in the modern and postmodern world is that we just leave out the left-hand quadrants pretty much entirely. They're just not talked about. They're not considered part of the issue. They're not considered part of the problem. If you even bring up some of these things, like stages of development that have been checked in over 40 different cultures, and you mention that to the average college professor, they have absolutely no bloody idea what you're talking about. They haven't even heard. I mean, it's unbelievable the number of really astonishing developmentalists we've had, from Abe Maslow to Jean Piaget to Lawrence Kohlberg, Carrick Gilligan, Kurt Fischer, Robert Keegan. I mean, it's just on and on and on. And they're absolutely ignorant of any of them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's horrifying.
Yeah.
Because this is the left end of the entire universe.
Right.
No matter. I mean, that's leaving out more than dark matter. I mean, that's a nightmare. This included. Yeah, the left-hand components and dark matter, and we know nothing about what's actually happening. So it's bad. And all of those, by the way, do nothing to help with orange plutocracy.
Right. Yeah, which is our next question. And before we go there, Ken, I just want to sort of double click a couple things that you said. I really, I think that when you're talking about social justice warrior culture and sort of the cultural relativism that they've adopted, it's actually interesting. I see them sort of caught in a paradox where, a lot of the SJWs feel, look, it is totally fine to discern, we could even call them growth hierarchies. We can say that, to not be a racist is better than to be a racist. To not be sexist is better than being sexist. To not be a homophobe is better than to be a homophobe. However, what their limitation is they can only apply that within their same group. Right. So for us white people, God, I hate white racists and white sexists and white homophobes. But the minute you start talking about another culture, it's like, no, we're not allowed to say anything about that.
Right.
We're not. So it's like there's nothing universal whatsoever in these value judgments that they're making even within their own group. They're making correctly within their own sort of group. But they're not allowed to extend those judgments to people who are outside of that, that little group, however they see it. And then, which leads, I think, to another issue. I really, really liked, Ken, how you presented the ideas of nationalism in terms of identity, because one of the paradoxes here is that, in terms of our political systems, our geopolitical systems, our economic systems, etc., nationalism is very clearly a step back. It is a regression. It is a return to, an attempt to return to some previous point in history. However, for the average liberal, when we're talking about these different, sort of the stack of identities that we all, sort of take on, nationalism is a step up. It's a step forward, because so many on the left get trapped in sort of the granularity of identity politics, where, the intersectionalism, where, the most important identity to me is simultaneously this weird mixture of the smallest possible identities and the largest possible identities. I am a, cisgendered, white, however you want to sort of chop up my identity into these really, really, really tiny pieces, who is also a human being and part of the global commons and a global citizen and all that. They skip all this meat in the middle, such as a healthy national identity. And I do believe that is the true but partial that I see in this sort of return to nationalism. Is it's actually an invitation to say, hey guys, can we maybe start forming identities together that transcend and include your race and your sexual preference and your religion and all of these other little identities that are often, again, used with all the right intentions, but nonetheless only have the effect of making us more separate from each other, and sort of creates this vibe of like, you have an obligation to understand my perspective, but at the same time, you can never understand my perspective. That's sort of the dilemma that a lot of liberals are imposing upon other people. This demand to be understood, alongside this insistence that because you don't come from my experience, you will never be able to understand my perspective. And if you try, that's a microaggression. And that, I think, really kind of nails a lot of the challenges that we have today, and why we're, I was looking at Google Trends last week, and I was looking up words like globalism. I was looking up words like nationalism, and what I saw was actually kind of interesting. Ken, with nationalism, there was a rhythm to going back 14 years, ever since Google started tracking these trends. There was a rhythm where I think it was every October, and then every March, there was a big surge in searches for the term nationalism, and then it would dip back down for the rest of the year. Every year for 14 years, dip up, dip down, dip up, dip down. It was clockwork. And then in 2016, you just see that term nationalism spike way, 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 way up. And and the searches weren't coming from America and weren't coming from the UK. It was coming from African countries. It was coming from developing nations who are being plugged into the internet in a lot of ways, for a lot of people, for a lot of these nations, for the very first time. And one of the things that they're actually searching for is nationalism, which is kind of funny because, respective to a lot of these developing nations, nationalism is a step up. It actually is a legitimate step up. But it's just interesting to see that trend kind of taking place. And I love, that we're able to have a conversation about this re-emergence of nationalism, both from a systemic point of view, but also from an identity-based point of view, because I do think that term means different things to different people. And people on the right tend to look at it in terms of identity. People on the left tend to look at it in terms of sort of systemic regression. And everyone has a lot to be concerned about, I think.
Those on the left look at it how?
People on the left relate to nationalism as a systemic regression, whereas people on the right look at nationalism as an improvement of identity. They see it in terms of their own.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem that it really can only be addressed by addressing the left-hand quadrants.
That's right.
That's what we're tracking here. And we really don't know exactly what those upper stages involve. Mm-hmm. We can track identity formation as it moves, just from your individual body to one with your mother, to one with their family, and again, sometimes a kind of community, sometimes a state, and then sometimes, of course, the nation. Mm-hmm. And with each of these, there's also an expansion of perspectives. So you're increasing the number of perspectives that you can agree with. So that's good.
Yep.
And then what happens at the nation state is that to the degree that an individual, even if it's just on a temporary stage, but to the extent that they identify with a national identity, and then others in that nation also identify with that national identity, then you really do start to get a type of unity in diversity.
Yeah.
So, and that's a very important step that has to be taken.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it has to go through a nation state or not, we don't know exactly. But we do know that nation state so far has, when it's worked to do that. And so one of the things that people sometimes have a hard time understanding about modern nation state is that they look at something like moral stages of development and they see them going from conventional, sort of egocentric, to conventional, conformist, to post-conventional, universal.
Mm-hmm.
Is that they'll think that their nation state is just at this conventional conformist stage of development.
Mm-hmm.
But actually the rules, the governing principles of nation states come from that universal orange state. Right. And that's where the Constitution comes from. It's a set of orange values. And so when it says things like all human beings are created equal, it doesn't mean all human beings in the United States.
Right.
It means human beings, period, all of them. And so that's why these original principles were applied to begin with only to those people who are already in power. So everybody's equal, everybody has freedom. That applied to basically white, property, able-bodied, cisgendered European males.
Yep.
Then that got extended to blacks, then that got extended to women, and that got extended to LGBTQ, and that got extended to virtually every minority you can think of, and we're still looking. And every single one of them is now under that tent of universal freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is a good thing. But that's the trouble that Green has a hard time recognizing.
That's right.
And so it will often want to just sort of, because it is the sensitive self, and it really is looking for oppression, particularly the types of oppression that Orange said they would cure, but never quite got around to. Mm-hmm. So Green revisits race and revisits sex and gender and ethnicities. And the problem with that is that identity politics really does have a tendency to reactivate tribalism. Mm-hmm. Or an actual regression to amber absolutistic. And that's one of the problems with that. Because what happens when you talk identity politics, and this, whether you're on the far right and you're talking about superiority of your race, whatever it might be, or whether it's on the far left and you're talking about the identity of victim groups and how that's your primary characteristic is your identity with that group. Mm-hmm. In both of those cases, all you're doing is emphasizing how your tribe is different from all the other tribes.
That's right.
Never talk about what your tribe has in common with all the other tribes.
Yep.
So you, by definition, are ethnocentric. You're not world-centric. And that's the problem, because humanity, particularly in the West, that's what they fought for hundreds of thousands of years, is to get over those ethnocentric orientations and find a broader world-centric universal rights of humankind. Not just your rights as a Christian or your rights as a German or your rights as a French person. your rights as a human being, period. And those are equal for every person who's a human being.
Right.
And that's what made those extraordinary.
Yeah.
And nation states, to the extent that they really were these post-conventional nation states, they incorporate those values into their governance systems. So we don't know now how quickly, or if at all, that nation self-identity can just be bypassed as we go global. And it's a real problem.
Yep.
And so you will have people that are green, for example, and sort of have again this sort of this sense of egalitarianism, although again they can't really do that by itself because they favor certain values and they claim those values are better than those other values. So they really don't believe in egalitarianism, but they're trying to get the point across is that you want to treat all people fairly, regardless of race or color or creed or gender, or any of that. But again, that's what all tribes have in common. That's not just what your tribe has in common. So we see people are at green and are often trying to really just sort of the nobility of that kind of orientation, then they're the ones that tend to believe, for example, it's a completely open border. And they can even consider borals to be immoral. And this is confusing two things. It's confusing just all human beings. Are all human beings equal? And the answer to that is yes. But then, okay, now how do we actually create functional gatherings of those human beings in a way that they can meet their fundamental life needs, desires, food, shelter, family, and some sort of income, and so on. And so far, that's dependent on creating nation states with actual borders. And then whatever a nation state does, whether it does it or not, it focuses on doing just for the people in its borders. So whenever we sort of hear like about multiculturalism or something, it's always about how our Western culture needs to import cultures, other cultures from overseas. But it's never vice versa. It's never like what Eritrea needs is some more Welsh food. Or, well, why not? I mean, it's multicultural. We just don't know how much of a jump can be made from, in terms of just self-identity. Can I really go from just a local community to a global village? Can I, and I mean, seriously, incorporate that in my own perspective system. So if I say, well, yesterday I was concerned with what was happening in my community. Now I'm concerned with what's happening in Afghanistan and South Africa and Argentina and Peru. And that's what I am right now, really. It doesn't look like that can happen. And so that's part of the things that we have to be working out. And the only way to work those things out is to include the left-hand quadrants in the discussion. And those on the table. That means when we talk about things like open borders, closed borders, all of that, we're not talking what those interiors actually are. We're just talking about exterior moves that you can take. Build the wall, tear it down. Really? I mean, it's embarrassingly anemic types of discussion. And this really isn't going to get better until we really do start including interiors as just these general orientation developments, the same way we do first through 12th grade now. And the places to see those implemented relatively quickly as education as possible. And then the whole religion segment, particularly those that do tend to be a little bit mythic, dogmatic, fundamentalist. You really do have to believe everything the Bible says. But if you had a religion, and by the way, just these evangelicals, as a simple example, but if you had a religion that, let's say, and again, it's very, very open to discussion, decided what to happen. This is just very briefly off the top of my head to show the kind of thing that's involved. But if you started into a particular religious belief, it would recognize growing up and it would recognize waking up. For growing up, you would, let's say that we selected, 6 or so major stages of adult development. Then when you came into the religion, you would come in and you'd wear your, let's say, amber hat. And that's where you would start. And you would see the whole doctrine laid out in amber terms. Christ really was born of a biological virgin. Christ really was dead and arose from the dead 3 days later and now lives on the right hand of God. Christ really, I mean, all of those are mythic literal statements. And they're absolutely appropriate at that stage. Beyond that stage, they have the same amount of believability as Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. They're just mythic statements. So you sort of that you'll also be able to read what an orange religious dogma looks like. And here's what a green religious dogma looks like. And here's what second tier looks like. And you would be aware of these from the beginning. And it wouldn't be anything to be ashamed of. Just like if you go study judo now, you know, you get a yellow belt and a green belt and a blue belt and a black belt and another black belt and so on. Nobody looks down on you for doing that kind of stuff. But what having these different, being in sort of, I'm in this different particular way of religious practice right now. And I'm either amber, I'm orange, or I'm green, or I'm teal, or I'm turquoise, something like that. What people would be learning is how to relate to those degrees, levels of awareness in themselves. They would actually look at, okay, when I was at amber, I thought that Christ was the one and only Son of God. Now I'm at orange, and I realized that that was like an introductory way to say how important this relationship is and how important it is for me. But now I can see that Christ was one of many world teachers, and they all have something important to say. And as a matter of fact, if I want to go study Buddha, I'm welcome to go study Buddha. But if I'm in the Christian faith right now, it's probably because Christ has spoken to me. Somehow I just feel closer to that lineage. And so that's why I say I'm a Christian, even though we would understand as Vatican II acknowledged, parenting, other religions can provide the same salvation as the church. That's orange. Only it took them 2,000 years to realize that, and they only murdered several million people who disagreed with it. But gosh, that's okay. Anyway, earlier stages do goofy things. So you'd be at orange, you'd understand that you have this great world teacher, and you'd likely at some point along here start to take up actual waking up practices. You start centering prayer. You start to do Christian contemplative prayer, something like that. And then you could just keep moving as you became more elder in the religion. And then you would eventually have your green hat, and then you would have your teal hat, and you would have your turquoise, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Given that, let's say upwards of 60% of the population in America is churched. That means they're going to church regularly and they believe it. And some 80, 90% of the world's population believes in those mythic forms of religion. And the whole overall problem, the main problem of the interior quadrant is that even if we look at, let's say, Robert Keegan's studies in just America, his research found that 3 out of 5 people don't make it to orange. That, again, 60% of the population is ethnocentric or lower.
Right.
So, I mean, every time they're making love, they're producing Nazis. I always say that, and I always get in trouble for it. I mean, if that's all we're doing is getting people up to ethnocentric, then all we're training them for is identity politics, whether on the left or on the right.
Yep.
And that is a retriation. And what's so bad about it is that usually comes with an almost visceral hatred of the nation that you're in. And I can understand that. What that means in these circumstances is you're denying the entity that allowed you to find a common ground with other minorities.
Mm-hmm.
You could talk about what your tribe had in common with other tribes. And that's why you were one nation. And what was good for one person was good for everybody, or should be. That was the whole point of a democratic government. But when you throw that nation state out, and you're also throwing out any drive to feel that you have something in common with, a white man or a native man or purple man or, whatever. And so that is contributing to our polarization as much as anything is. And it's horrifying. I mean, it's just horrifying. And the data doesn't lie. We are doing horrible at helping people develop in the stages that are more diverse and more inclusive. We're doing that bad. And that's a real nightmare. So it's just a world federation. We still don't have enough data or research or information to tell us, okay, even as we go to a world federation, and I'm calling it a federation right now in the sense that the United States considered itself, like in the Federalist Papers, considered itself a union of separate states, all bound together. So they maintain some of the major differences between the states, but then they also envelop them in a United States.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, as we look at the original types of world federation that might form, I think they would be a federation at first, that most nation states would still stay nation states.
Yep.
But then how we decide to divide up power among them, then that's going to change. And there were a few items that I jotted down in terms of one of the ways that we could have a world federation.
Should we get through the next question before getting there, Ken, or do you wanna let us have that now?
What was the question?
I said I'm wondering, should we get to the second question before you get into those ways, or do you think that's relevant to share now?
Yeah, I was simply looking at the second question page notes, and I assumed I was there, but I got ahead of myself.
Well, let's just ask the question, and I've got a couple real brief clips to play.
Sure.
First, let me say that since it does look like you're wearing Captain Kirk's Star Trek shirt, I think Integral Federation is totally the appropriate name for this.
Yeah,
totally works for me. So yeah, let's talk real briefly about exactly that: globalism, nationalism, plutocracy, which is like, I guess, 3 out of 4 of the, horsemen of the apocalypse. And it's it should be an interesting conversation, because usually when we're talking about culture wars, usually what we're doing is we're exploring the most vicious expressions of green on one side and amber on the other, or what we call the mean green meme and maybe the mean amber meme. And by mean, what we really mean is what happens when these altitudes, when these values, when these views get sort of hijacked by a red subconscious, sort of an undigested piece of ourselves that's still greedy and needy and wants to own the entire world. And I think that because these conversations is usually framed as a struggle between amber and green, orange kind of slips out the back door unnoticed a lot of times, where I think actually a lot of these conflicts are often amplified, sustained, and even sometimes manufactured by the mean orange meme, namely, transnational plutocracy. And I think a lot of it comes from this sort of insidious strategy to keep people divided and distracted away from, a lot of the disasters of things like wealth inequality, neoliberal corruption, the tragedy of the commons, etc. So I figured maybe we spend a little bit of time talking about globalism, plutocracy, and what you've been really, I think, driving towards in this conversation, which is the need for a more integral global regulator, an integral federation by any other name. So in our last episode together, you made some really interesting points, which you sort of summarized again today, but let me play this short video clip real quickly. Let's see here. All right, here we go.
Right now, government is confined to nation states. That's the fundamentally highest form of real government that we have. The market, on the other hand, with its free market, and then we try to curtail it with certain moral sanctions, no slavery, no trafficking, that kind of stuff. But otherwise, the market tends to be very competitive and aggressive in that sense. And the problem is the market is now global, but governments are national.
Right.
And we don't have a balance there, and that's producing some disasters because we really don't have a government that can match the size of the market, and therefore the government can oversee the market in very limited but important ways. And so we have, that's an issue. And so now we have nation states punked in this global competitive free market, and anything that a nation state does that's going to help help the environment, but if it does so, it'll cost it hugely in terms of economic competitiveness. We have a market that's actually driving us into more and more externalities, more and more environmental destruction. And we don't have anything to counterbalance that. And that's a nightmare.
Yep.
So this is a real important issue that we have to keep in mind as we're thinking about ways to move forward integrally.
So then I've got another short clip where I read a brief excerpt from Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, where I think you really, present the challenges and the opportunities around a genuine transnationalism. So let me share that now. You say the global nature of this transformation is now being driven, particularly in its technological economic base, by 3 interrelated factors. Number 1, the necessity to protect the global commons, the common biosphere that belongs to no nation, no tribe, no creed, no race. Number two, the necessity to regulate the world financial system, which no longer responds to national borders. And number three, the necessity to maintain a modicum of international peace and security, which is now not so much a matter of major war between any two nations, but between a new order of loosely federated nations and renegade regimes threatening world peace. The point is that all three of those concerns no longer respond to actions taken merely on the part of individual nations.
Right.
Not one of those problems can be solved on a national level. They are literally transnational crises demanding transnational world-centric responses. And exactly how to negotiate this difficult transition with nations voluntarily surrendering some of their sovereignty for the global betterment, therein precisely is the extremely difficult nature of this post-national global transition.
Absolutely.
And awesome. Great quote.
Yep.
So,
and that's part of the problem. And that is tied in with directly with the idea of how many people themselves have a mindset that is even driven towards that kind of global understanding or embrace.
that's right.
Because clearly, one of the major divisions between a lot of political things now is that it's dividing up into globalists on the one hand and populists on the other.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's still at a point where most of the items that are really crucial to make those determinations aren't being taken into account.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually have a relatively significant portion of the population that is driven toward an understanding of global embrace, not only just a kind of positive, sort of loving, expansive type of stance, but also looking at some of the major problems that we're dealing with, three of which we just mentioned: the global commons, global financial, and global peace, or global COPs. Whether they're thinking positively or negatively, the number of people that are in favor of that is going to be a crucial component of how fast that starts to come into account.
Yeah.
And particularly, we are going to have problems with most of the politicians in a nation state structure, because they really are, unless they're just unbelievably poor and undeveloped, any of the nations that have some sort of wealth or some sort of advantage in terms of sovereignty, they're not going to like just give up. And so one of the main problems about a world federation is it's very hard to tell just when we'll have an amount of the population large enough to even want to support something like that.
Right.
And mostly what we get in these discussions are people saying things that, in the right hand, things that need to be done. So we need some sort of technological advantage. We need some sort of international communication, information exchange systems. We need a whole new United Nations infrastructure that will open up onto more effective world federation and so on. And we don't hear anything about what has to happen just in terms of the human population itself.
That's right.
Wanting to do something like that. Because again, in the increasingly democratic times, people are going to just have a very hard time coming in and saying, okay, we've got about 20 million people that want this, and they're in government, so we're just going to force it on everybody.
Yep.
And, leave 7 billion people going, I don't want that. That's not going to work. And so part of what we're going to have to do, it looks like, is have some sort of series of transitions in the World Federation setup. And for example, and they probably have to have like 4 or 5 different houses, each of which had a different kind of power. So whether we actually have these separate houses or not, each of these issues are something that's going to have to be taken into account one or another. So on the one hand, we might have something like a Senate, and then what would happen there, again, just making these details up, but each particular nation state that now exists gets the same number of senators, and that's what the Senate is, today's Senate in the United States. And so it doesn't matter that states like South Dakota have 2 senators and states like California have 2 senators. That doesn't seem fair, but that's not what they're there for. They're there to represent the sovereignty of the individual governing system.
That's right.
And as a transition, that's going to have to be acknowledged. So we have some sort of Senate where every nation state on the planet had the same number of representatives in that. And then we would have some sort of House, which would be based on population. And so that would, in essence, be a type of democracy. And I think that what's really crucial is that it would be created in a parliamentary style. And as you know, I think a parliamentary form of government right now is best we can do to allow new types of political parties to emerge. Because if we talk about, well, should we spend our time sort of helping the Democrats out because they're, the closest to second tier? And you go, yeah, well, but the Democrats already have their old liberals that came from Orange. Mm-hmm. And now they've got the new left, the far left that comes from Green. And these two already don't get along at all. So if we added a third integral party to that, it would be a meaningless political party. It's just not going to do very much at all. So unless the Democratic Party actually grows itself into integral representatives, something much more like a parliamentary form, I think would work better. Mm-hmm. And then we'd have to have some sort of House that it takes the nation states today and comes up with some sort of multivariate system to determine how much power or wealth or advantage or privilege that each nation state has. And however those were ranked, the ones that have the most power, control, wealth today would get a proportionately larger representation in that one House, not in the others, but in that one. And that's just to take care of the problems of having powerful nations today give some of their power and sovereignty. And why would they want to do that in any event? So that was sort of transition stage that I think would be important to entice the upper third of the countries to give their power away to the lower thirds. Mm-hmm. I think there needs to be some sort of um, sort of integral, well, whatever name, a type of integral overall framework that allows the situation of values in relation to these developmental unfoldings. Mm-hmm. And it would also include all four quadrants, for example, and just down the road, really, quadrant, levels, line, states, and types. If we look at something like today's transgender, it's very heated and it's very polarized. And what you have are one group of people, Ben said, typical of this, that is focusing on the upper right. And so they're focusing on just straight biological data. And the biology is pretty straightforward. With a few genetic anomalies, there are two sets. It's X and Y or X and X. And you don't get to choose those. Whatever you're born with, that's what you are. And every cell in your body has structure. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to change it by just taking hormones or surgery or something like that. So the people that believe in just that point of view really strongly would say that somebody who's transgendered is essentially suffering a mental illness because they're simply not recognizing the genuine reality the way it is. So Ben Shapiro, things like, my grandfather used to be a psychotic and he'd hear the radio talking, but we wouldn't go around and say, that's right, Dad, radio is talking to you. Yes, go ahead. It's all fine. He said, because it was just false. So they're focusing on just that quadrant. Mm-hmm. Those who are for transgender rights, and New York City now, by the way, last I heard, it's growing daily, over 60 different official genders that you can you can choose, literally. Well, that's the way it looks in the upper left. And is that possible? Of course, it's absolutely possible. It's already happening. Yep. There are already people that feel that way and they're that way, and they know that's what they are. Phenomenologically, that's real. And so you can't just deny their experienced reality. It's these kinds of things that cause constant sort of arguing. And there's no real resolution to it because both of them are partially right.
That's right.
And so they can always argue that way.
Yep.
And you see the same thing at almost any discipline that you look at, including ones that are cause the most controversy in the culture wars, such as feminism. Mm-hmm. And there's enormous arguments. Most feminists, for example, don't even believe in upper right quadrant science.
Right.
They just flat out deny any reality to it. It's the product of a hyperlogical patriarchy, and it's meant to oppress women, and it just has no reality at all. And then they will sort of end up focusing in on one quadrant that they think is the most important, and that's the only one that they'll support. And you get, I still was really impressed with the work of Janet Chaffetz, and she's a really brilliant feminist systems theorist. And she wrote several books that attempted to demonstrate fairly clearly, I think, that men and women in the upper right quadrant have two basically universal concepts, and these are real. and you can't really deny them. One is that women give than paid. One is that men on average have a greater upper body strength. Mm-hmm. And then using just those two factors, she goes back through all of the techno-economic stages of development that human beings went through and shows how those biological universals actually drive dramatically different types of male and female roles throughout history. Same universals, but they give dramatically different results based on where you are in the lower right quadrant. And there's an enormous amount of truth to that. So just to give a few examples, I've talked about this before, but I think it's really interesting about why all four quadrants, why a whole framework is required. But the stages of techno-economic development that even most liberals, I mean, most feminists seem fairly comfortable with, is the one put forward by Gerhard Linsky, because it's just so neutral and it's so non-political and it fits the facts so well. And his stages, he had several, but the main ones going straight up were hunting and gathering, horticultural, agrarian, industrial, informational. Mm-hmm. And just those two biological differences drove dramatically different roles of men and women in each of those societies.
That's right.
So in hunting and gathering, the sex roles weren't well differentiated, but men tended to hunt because of the upper body strength, and women tended to gather, and that was pretty straightforward. The really interesting change happened as human beings discovered farming. And at first, it was a very simple form of farming called horticultural. And that's farming that's done with just a simple digging stick or hoe. And even a pregnant woman can engage in that kind of activity. It's not a medical threat to her, and she can do it easily. And so about 80% of the foodstuffs in horticultural societies were produced by women. Mm-hmm. And what's so interesting is that about a third of all horticultural societies have female-only deities. It's so-called matriarchy. And this is the only place you find matriarchy is in horticultural societies. And this changed dramatically. So women weren't being forced out of the productive sphere and just into the reproductive sphere, participating in the productive sphere. When agrarian came up, agrarian was farming done with an extremely heavy animal-drawn plow. And pregnant women who engaged in that had extremely high rates of miscarriage. And Shafet's point is that it was to their Darwinian advantage not to plow. That was like, they look at the men and go, okay, Mr. Strength, you go do that shit. I'm not going to have anything to do with it. And so they stepped out of the productive sphere. If anything can be called patriarchal societies, those were it. But Shafet is really clear to say, just be careful about calling it oppression, because the women weren't oppressed. They chose not to engage in kind of suicidal activity. Mm-hmm. So about 95% of those societies have male-only deities. So you can see how that's switching, and you can see the roles that men and women are playing. Then when you get to the industrial society, all of a sudden, machines are doing labor on behalf of humans that men used to have to do. Mm-hmm. So there's not as strong a selection of men to be into that productive sphere. So you start to find the rise, well, among other things, you find the emancipation of slaves, you find the rise of women's movements that would eventually lead to things like women getting the right to vote and so on. And so that was a big, big change. And then when you get to informational, there's no demand that the physical body is making, the nature, physical nature is making on human beings that requires a great deal of bodily strength. So men aren't being selected for that anymore. And the only differences that are starting to show up, and this is where it gets controversial, is in things like a STEM field. Because here, the evidence seems to suggest that one of the major differences between men and women, and this is the largest difference we can find, it lasts the entire lifespan, and it shows up in men and women starting from day one. And that's that baby boys are interested in things, and baby girls are interested in people. And that interest tends to stay up with them essentially again throughout their lives. And it's the largest difference we can measure between men and women. So if you look at the ratio of men and women getting college degrees in 1972, 61% of college degrees went to men and only 39% went to women. And this appeared to be sort of so out of whack that we started instituting a lot of social practices to try to change that. We were very, very successful. And by 2018, those numbers had switched. In today's college, 61% of college degrees go to women and only 39% go to men. And interestingly, the only disciplines, literally the only disciplines where men outnumber women is in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, because those are working with dead things, not people. As a matter of fact, in the science part of STEM, the men only outnumber the women in the sciences dealing with dead things like physics and chemistry. As soon as you get into biology, psychology, sociology, women outnumber men. So the question is, if since it's sort of 61% to 39%, is an unfair imbalance? And if so, then do we want to start clamping down on women? That's not something you generally hear us say. So the whole point, though, is that we do want to make sure that we are allowing, that we're not just an equal outcome, that, for example, because men and women are sort of 50% and 50% of the population, that therefore the number of men and women in STEM fields should be exactly 50 to 50.
Right.
Or the number of men and women in the legal profession should be exactly 50-50. So that's a whole type of value reorientation, however, that doesn't just try to flatten out the values, or in particular, doesn't just take one particular value age and absolutize that.
Right.
So what it does with that plutocracy is absolutize winning and losing.
Yeah.
And anything that takes away from that is looked at as just being demonic. You're not supposed to do that. And then, of course, we talked about green and its egalitarianism, but then it still has to sort of sneak in values that it really prefers, because otherwise you can't get, there's nothing to protest if everything's equal.
Right. Yeah, Ken, at some point, I really want to do a series of conversations with you that I've been roughly thinking of as sort of like the baby in the bathwater saving liberalism from itself, or something along those lines, where we can actually go through a lot of these issues. And one of the big ones was what you just mentioned, was the transgender controversy. And what I see is the good news is that, you know, the modern left, particularly through feminism, has done a really good job of differentiating things like sex and gender and sexual orientation, sexual identity, etc., rather than sort of placing that all in the upper right quadrant. We actually now have sort of a four-quadrant approach to an individual's sexuality and their sexual preferences. That's the good news. The bad news is when it goes way too far in any one of these quadrants. When you replace one type of absolutism for another, and then, for example, you've got Tumblr style, gender studies, where, as you say, there's 85 different genders to choose from, which basically renders gender completely meaningless. It deconstructs it into oblivion.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's what you guys were trying to do with that. But the good news is, again, we got this out of purely the upper right quadrant, and now we can start having more interesting conversations about how our sexual identities actually, take form.
Well,
Um,
sure.
and now, and to return it to what you were talking about earlier, with sort of the steps by which we might one day be able to achieve an integral federation, a global integral federation. It seems to me, Ken, that the one thing that I see in common in terms of the grassroots on the left and the grassroots on the right is their mutual disgust with plutocracy. I think that is the one of the main issues that's really driving, and they're coming up with very different solutions in order to deal with that plutocracy. But again, to go back to those two clips I played from you earlier, I think that actually has a lot of explanatory power in terms of where plutocracy comes from in the first place. And, basically the idea is, as you said, the economic systems have gone transnational, and yet our governing systems are stuck at the national level, which means that there is a governance vacuum at the level of the transnational holon, right? And since nature abhors a vacuum, it's always going to fill a vacuum. That space ends up, that space where a global regulator should be, ends up getting filled up by corporate interests and agendas, and which results in sort of the corporate plutocracy that we have today. So plutocracy is not the result of national governments. It's actually the inevitable result of a lack of a real effective globalism, the lack of a global transnational regulator. So in my equation, this recent regression that we're seeing in the West towards nationalism is itself a response in its own way to plutocracy. But I think it actually makes it worse, because this is nationalism in contrast to transnationalism. And it doesn't curtail plutocracy, it actually reinforces plutocracy, because what it's doing is it's ceding territory to these plutocratic interests, who basically end up saying, well, since there's no meaningful governance here, we'll just create one of our own in our own image. So I think that, one of the main issues that we're seeing, and we're seeing this criticized both on the right and on the left, is that today's version of globalism is it's a very flatland globalism. It's hamstrung by the fact that there's no real strong global regulator in place to, as you say, enforce policy. It doesn't have police, doesn't have military, doesn't have any teeth to it. It just has the United Nations kind of whining about shit all the time. And, that really doesn't get much done. There's clearly a lot to criticize about the version of globalism that we've sort of created today, namely that it's an international globalism, not a transnational globalism. So we're having a sort of a conflict, a holonic conflict here, where a lower level is trying to regulate a higher level, but literally can't, because it doesn't have the tools, the implement, that it needs in order to do such a thing. So therefore, it's what we have today is a globalism that is influenced in a lot of ways by exactly the plutocratic interest that it was set up to sort of try to regulate and to control and to mitigate. So at the same time, as you mentioned earlier, this weak globalism, as we call it, is also responsible for some genuine 20th century miracles, 21st century as well, miracles in terms of pulling people out of poverty and putting people into work, and there's fewer food shortages today than there ever have been. Now climate change might make things a little bit tough again, but our sort of post World War II experiment with globalism has yielded a lot of fruit and has reduced a lot of suffering, even while creating sort of more local suffering for in the Rust Belt in the United States of America, for example. So all of which is to say that I think that this move towards nationalism is a response to plutocracy, but it's only going to make plutocracy that much worse, because you're actually saying, well, no, we're no longer interested in creating a global regulator. We blame the global regulator for bringing us into this, mess in the first place. But it sounds like you're saying something different. I mean, in a lot of ways, it sounds like Ken Wilber is a globalist, just this radically sort of new kind of globalism that really hasn't, we're only just beginning to come up with language to describe.
Well, I am looking at in terms of globalism is that if we're ever going to get to a point where we're going to have some sort of global world federation, and it really does have court of last resort powers over everything else, every other governance system on the planet. What this one says will have some sort of finality in terms of decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order for that to occur, then that's going to truly be representing all people globally. That would rather be the point of it. And the problem there is, the one that I keep bringing up, is we're still not sure how to get individual identity from where it is now to a point where it would support something like that.
That's right.
And if we don't do that, then we're not going to get a global world federation.
Yep.
If you've still got 70, 80% of the population that hates that idea, nobody would get elected. Things would just, it's not, it won't happen. And that's that little bit of that problem with democracy. We really do have to find ways to appeal to a large number of people.
Mm-hmm.
And in order for those people to, and I have to put this carefully, but I'll just say, in order for them to embrace the kinds of values that most caring human beings would want, then there has to be some more interior development occurring. And we're not seeing that because we don't acknowledge that. So when I look at globalism right now, what I see is this global economic system that has very few constraints on it.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know how to get from a present nation state, a present global state. And one of the main reasons we don't know how to do that is because we don't get individuals who will support something like that actually growing and develop in the first place. So I see all of these issues occurring in the right-hand quadrants, and all of the globalists, the market-driven, winner-take-all type of mentality. And that's something that, at least in many ways, that winner-take-all mentality that comes straight from Orange, that is what we see expanded, embodied, and glorified in most of the big companies today.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want competition. They're all essentially monopolies, and they don't want to let go of any of that kind of power.
Right.
They are winner take all, and they do not want to change at all. And so that's not helping. And that's a human problem. So the only way that you're going to get something like Google to stop skewing information searches in a way, there's a guy out of, I don't know if it's Stanford or Yale, that calculated the number of votes that big tech companies like Google and Facebook could alter without people knowing they're altering their votes is upwards of over 13 million votes. So that's the kind of winner take all plutocracy that we're getting. And tech is helping here. I mean, it's one of the prime drivers. And that was disturbing because the whole plutocracy itself took its first really major leap with the Industrial Revolution. And so you could really have the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers and all of this stuff really making these killings in terms of the amount of wealth that they could gather and the types of inequality that started to exist there. And all we've found technology has done has made it worse. The inequality factor has just continued to jump. Now, it's even while it's helping people come out of abject poverty, it's not doing anything to help with this inequality. We mentioned last time that now the count is something like 5 people owned 50% of the wealth on the planet.
It's absurd.
That's just starts to sound obscene, even evil. I mean, it's just a horrifying. And now, of course, you always want to be careful, again, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater or not to engage in so many things that you cripple the capacity for individuals to be motivated by market and to create things and make the world better.
Yep.
That even though it deals with a very narrow segment of human reality, the market has been able to do that in some fundamental ways. And it would be really, really problematic if we broke that part of the machine as we were trying to fix.
That's right.
And so one of the things that we sort of keep coming back to, and this might seem a little bit off topic, whenever I've seen various suggestions on how we would get some sort of higher values into our economic system. And this, anything from spiritual values and then whoever's writing the book, it's of course their version of spirituality, and they want that in the marketplace, and that's going to cure everything. Or there are even a handful of people that are writing about, well, if we're going to have an integral, literally aqua integral form of governance, then this is what we have to do. And almost all of them just sort of end up by default kind of dumping something that they'll call things like a house of wisdom, and that we would add that to our present government. And then the house of wisdom would embody all of the higher values and wisdom and so on. But to the extent that you think about how to get there right now,
right,
that's one of the few things that people can come up with. So even somebody who I admire very much, Alan Watkins, he and I did this book on Wicked and Wise, and how an integral approach can attack wicked problems. He wrote a book called Crowdocracy, and it's based on a general trend you see, which is that if you have just a large crowd of people and there's some sort of decision that you have to make, it could even be something like, how long should a double suspension bridge be? And you have everybody turn in what results they think. In an enormous number of cases, just the average uneducated crowd comes up with the most successful. And so there has been a lot of research on that, and it really is a slightly odd and interesting thing. So Alan Watkins and his co-author wrote a book on how we can make that work. They called it Crowdocracy. But even what they do is they slightly reinterpret how the executive branch would go, and then how the legislative branch would go to take advantage of crowdocracy. But when it comes to the judicial branch, then they all of the judges in the entire judicial branch must be trained in integral principles. And if any recommendation comes from the legislative or executive branch, fit through those integral principles, it'd be like through a United States Constitution, then they get to alter how they're done until they do reflect truly integral orientations. So you can see even there, a very smart, sober, rational person finds that they have to slide the values they want, under the door and sneak them into the system because it's just not really clear how to get from here to here without doing that.
Right.
And so I have a fourth house, just so I can say, and this would be the house that would be the house of wisdom, and they would be trained in integral stuff, and they would check things, but however you want to include something like that. But I do think world federations are going to have to be a kind of federation squared. In other words, they're going to have to take into account not just the kind of existing governing systems that are there already, but they're going to have to come up with these transition ways that will get them out of the type of orientation they have now, which in almost every case, belief in sovereignty. And I don't want to give up my sovereignty. And that's not what we should do as a nation state. Mm-hmm. Certainly those nation states have the most amount of power and the most amount of wealth and the most amount of privilege. They're not going to want to give that up either. And so we're going to have sort of different sub-branches of the federation that address each of those issues. So as I said, a house that just every country gets 2 senators, and another, which is it's an actual democratic vote, preferably along a parliamentary line. And then some sort of way, another house that would allow a relative prioritization among countries that already have power and allow the votes in that house to be given relatively more to the ones that already have power. So they're already giving up their sovereignty. In that house, for example, the United States might get 10 votes and Ecuador might get 2 votes or something like that. But we're going to have to take that into account one way or another, because there's no way in hell something like the United States or China or even Russia is going to just give up all its power.
Yeah, of course.
Not going to, not now.
Yep.
And then the fourth is a kind of a throwaway. Yeah, we'd have wisdom and we'd have some way to check these through, fully balanced value structures, so that if you do get a vote, like, okay, how many genders can you have? You're not going to just say, oh, well, there's only 2, or, well, there's as many as you want.
Right.
So we'll have at least some that kind of thing. And those kinds of things cause, some of the biggest problems that we have in today's world. Yeah. And then behind all of that is the growth that has to occur in the left-hand quadrants in order to get enough people and enough cultures to a point where they even want that kind of world federation. And that's always overlooked. And that's the absolutely crucial issue. And in order to get that to happen, we have to have probably education and probably religions to get on a conveyor belt and have those 2 institutions more oriented towards a more equal approach. Yeah. And this isn't something that we're just making up, because at least in development and health, those higher integral stages, we have evidence for those. Those stages exist If you test a population of people, you'll see that they go through these stages of development, and the highest stages of development are not orange or green. The highest are second tier, teal, and turquoise. Those are there. Those are waiting. We're not putting that up. This isn't just, oh, I like these values, so let's throw the whole world into those values. No, those values are the next inherent stage in development that individuals take if they keep growing.
Yeah.
That's all we're doing.
Yep.
Is saying, hey, let's take account of those.
Yep.
Since
and in fact, anything less is tyranny.
shows that they're more loving, more caring, include more perspectives, more diversity, and are more inclusive.
Yep. Yeah. I was just saying anything less is tyranny. I mean, any first tier approaches to governance and to politics, when you take them to their natural conclusion, it results in one form of tyranny or another. And I think that is another one of the points in our sort of wanting to see something like an integral federation emerge at some point in our future. And I think another difference that a genuinely integral global regulator would have, Ken, is that a lot of people on the right, they have allergies to these kinds of conversations because they have a legitimate allergy to the idea of a purely top-down form of governance where everything is being dictated by what they'll perceive as a bunch of elites. And hey, fair enough. Right. I mean, if that is what this turned into, that would genuinely be a big problem. And that's where we're seeing, deep state type rhetoric coming from. It's this distrust in the idea that there's this higher echelon of people with authority that I don't have, and they're hammering that authority down on my head. And that is curtailing my freedoms and my liberties. And worst of all, there's no recourse. There's no due process for me to be able to hold those people accountable. So I say totally fair enough. And America in particular, being as sort of, ruggedly individualist as we are, it's sort of, it's in our DNA in a certain kind of way. There's always going to be this sort of distrust, this conspiratorial distrust of these larger systems of self-organization that are impacting our lives. So I think one of the big differences that an integral federation would have compared to like a neoliberal globalization that we've seen so far is that the integral federation would actually prioritize the integration, the harmonization, the inclusion of all other regulators building up to it, so that this global hold-on is actually, as you say, it's not completely subsuming to the point of eradicating the nation state hold-on, which is not completely eradicating, statehood itself, which is not eradicating, county laws and city laws, and then what I can do with my family and what I can do individually. So I think that a truly global hold-on is actually going to be able to harmonize this entire chain of regulators in such a way that people have less of the fear that this is being imposed upon me by some, again, by plutocratic elites who I don't trust. Why am I going to hand them the keys to the world? I don't trust them as far as I can throw them, because they're just going to, violate my personal sovereignty or my individual rights or so forth. And I think that's actually, something really novel that would emerge. It would be a turquoise global constitution. And just like, the American Constitution, as you're talking about earlier, it sort of jumped out at me how brilliant that document really was in terms of allowing for both these deep features, right? Things like all men are created equal. Things like, the pursuit of life, liberty, and, the pursuit of happiness. These are the deep structures, the deep features of the United States Constitution. The surface features was sort of the mechanics of it all, the actual laws that were being encoded and enacted, which the framers knew these laws will change, right? These surface features will change over time and over multiple generations, but these deep features are universal and they're timeless, and they ain't going anywhere. And that's how I think, in terms of the history of this country, this is how we've been able to make so much progress, because we're actually bending the surface features to be more aligned with that sort of the highest ideals of the deep features that are actually encoded into the Constitution. We need a global turquoise Constitution that does something very similar.
Well, yeah, exactly. And there's, you were going to ask how we can get to, right?
Yeah, should I read that question?
Sure.
Okay, so yeah, this whole conversation, we have been, exploring this big, bold, beautiful vision of a more integral approach to politics and governments. But for me, the question remains, how do we get from here to there? So in other words, what are the micro level steps that we can take towards enacting this big macro level vision of global transformation? As you've already mentioned some of the problems where, a lot of people basically try to leapfrog, take like 10 steps instead of just one. And that's where you get things like, well, let's kind of slip these values in there and let's create a house of wisdom. It's these idealistic, it's coming from a great, beautiful place of idealism, but the pragmatics are a little bit, that's probably going to hurt your case, not really help it. And I think that it's obviously a very difficult question to answer, because, the solutions are going to be a bit different from nation to nation, culture to culture, depending on sort of the on the ground realities that you find there. Here in the United States, I think that a lot of this is constrained by the lower right quadrant. So in this country, we have something called a first past the post voting system, where basically whoever gets the most votes gets the entire state's electoral college votes, and that's how this is done. What that actually does is it prohibits the emergence of the type of parliamentary system that you had mentioned in last month's call. Because when you have a first past the post system, you are forced into creating the broadest possible coalitions, which on the one hand is good because you're actually saying, well, we kind of, each of these two parties needs a center of gravity, and we need to have enough connective tissue to get people talking to get at least half the country talking, with each other, and the other half of the country talking with each other. But it definitely dilutes the system, and it prevents, I think, some of the more novel solutions from coming through. Until that's fixed, I think, the best we can do is basically try to figure out how to more skillfully engage with the two-party system as we have it today. Now, the good news is this first past the post system, it's not like, written into our destiny or anything like that. I mean, we actually just saw in Maine, the state of Maine just adopted a ranked choice system, which is much more open to allowing these kinds of different approaches, these different third party, fourth party, fifth party approaches to actually manifest in our time. And that's really cool. The question is, which of our two parties, because we are still stuck in this two-party system, which of our two parties is going to be more likely to enact a system like that on a national level? Now, I have my sense. I mean, I personally think, well, the Democrats will be more likely than, the Republicans to do that, because right now where the Republicans are in terms of just, where the pendulum is today, is they are really trying to secure their own legitimacy in the face of dwindling demographics and all that. I still continue to think that someday, maybe 50 years from now, the Republicans are going to pop out the other side as probably the world's or the country's first genuinely integral party, but that's only going to be because they're forced to learn how to speak across multiple values and so forth because of their diminishing demographics. So I remain hope that we're going to see that, but we're a long way from here to there. I also think we're starting to see the first hints of a genuine world-centric conservatism that we haven't really seen in several decades. We haven't really seen since, I don't know, before Gingrich. And that's hopeful. However, even though that's emerging and we're starting to see it take root in places like, the IDW, the intellectual deep web, we're starting to see little glimmers of it, but still it is very much of a I'll use the phrase again, a cognitive minority that's not really having much of an influence or an impact upon the rest of the GOP, who are, basically still up to their same old thing. So for me, as an integral progressive, an independent integral progressive, and again, I define my progressivism by, I want to see things like integral federations emerge. I want to see systems emerge that don't currently exist. That's the progressive side of my sort of political orientation. The question for me is, where should my friends and I place our energy? Should we, you kind of were getting to this earlier, should we try to make the Democratic Party as healthy as possible? Saving the babies from the bathwater, trying to push some cohort of that party towards increasingly integral solutions and views and considerations, simply because there's more post-conventional people over there, or not? Or should we be, helping clear a space for the emergence of this world-centric conservatism that is so desperately needed right now? I mean, my sense is you're going to say maybe both, maybe at the same time, maybe neither. But it seems clear to me that all of us need to feel like we are somehow putting our hands on the wheel somewhere, that we are actually doing our best to enact these visions and these views in the lower right quadrant, in the lower left quadrant, however and wherever we can. And I guess I'm asking you, what do you think are the sort of the leverage points? Where can we get the most traction here?
It's so disappointing to see where the political parties themselves are right now. I mean, we sort of have to forgive them all because they're essentially first-tier organizations. Mm-hmm. And so as such, they're by definition fragmented, partial, towards absolutism, and that can really be a problem. We also have this whole issue with the left, as where it started out with orange liberal values. That's where it got started. And it was, we've mentioned it before, but the at that time were in favor. First of all, they had moved to orange, so they really didn't like mythic Christian thinking. So they started to ditch that. They did like rational science, so they started to embrace that. It was world-centric, it wasn't ethnocentric. So it really did get rid of slavery. It really did the emancipation movements. Mm-hmm. It was interested in universal individual rights, and that was dramatically. And it just happened that they sat in the left-hand seats in the French Assembly, and the conservatives at the time sat in the right-hand seats, and so they were just called left and right. And that was essentially the major political orientations until the 1960s. And then there we saw the emergence of green. And that was it wasn't rational, universal, systematic. It was relativistic, egalitarian, multicultural, and so on, mm-hmm. although always applied with a performative contradiction. So it was always saying things like, well, there is no objective truth. And so you say, well, but you believe what you're saying is true, right? You go, yeah, well, okay, what I'm saying is true, but then there is no other values are the same. Well, but you think you holding that value is better than people who don't hold that value, right? So you contradicted yourself there. I mean, it just sort of went on like that. And then part of the problem was because it had deconstructed things like universal individual rights, it did start replacing that with identity politics, group rights.
Mm-hmm.
And that really opened up to a retribalization. And as that leading edge began to crumble or just actually break, what we call green, then that allowed the orange plutocratic winner take all mentality to explode, because it wasn't being regulated appropriately by the growing tip. The growing tip was broken.
Yep.
And really couldn't offer much, absolutizing its own tribalizing tendency. And it absolutized equality. Everything has equal outcome. It has to be the same. Again, it believed that its values were better than all of those others.
Mm-hmm.
That allowed this enormous confusion in both of the political parties, because where traditional progressives, being progressive, had bumped up from orange to green, traditional conservatives who started out serving ethnocentric guys, they bumped up to orange. She started embracing the original liberal values. And so you had these two branches to both political parties. And so the modern orange right orientation started vocally supporting things like free speech, whereas the postmodern left was trying to deny it. And the sensitive self of the postmodern left was willing to suspend free speech if it hurt any of their sacred victim group identities. And so that started to become a real issue on the intellectual web. You have people like Brett Weinstein saying, I mean, he still identifies with the left. He says he identified his life as his Weinstein does. He said he was just flabbergasted that the modern right was becoming the champions of free speech and individual freedom and individual equality. And he said he was flabbergasted because, quote, "This is not the right that I grew up with." Mm. So you're starting to see these switches in both of these. And it's really becoming confusing in certain ways. It's certainly the case, a lot of people that considered themselves members of the left, including virtually every member on the intellectual dark, but they stopped identifying themselves with being on the left because they started to realize that left and liberal no longer meant the same thing. Mm. Green was illiberal. It was post-liberal or even anti-liberal, did not favor individual freedoms, and was willing to suspend all of those if any group identity hurt or offended or anything like that. And so it got into this intense identity politics, which again simply emphasizes different from all the other tribes, and it's held on to in an absolutistic fashion. So it does tend to regress. We always expected to see the far right, the extreme right, come from amber ethnocentric orientations. It was a shock to see the far left join them.
That's right.
At those ethnocentric, tribalistic, prejudiced stages. Every single person on the intellectual dark web has reported that they have never once been invited to to an organization to speak at a left-wing organization, not once. Every one of them have been invited to speak to organizations that are right-wing. And that just goes to show this ordinary turmoil that's going on within these political parties.
Yep.
And it's certainly one of the reasons that if you're going to try and pick a party to try and, help along, at this point, it's getting very close to a toss-up. You don't want to right, goes that saying, but you don't want to left either. That's part of the problem. So this is again why something like a parliamentary system is something that I think, however anybody has any sort of influence or access or can help that conversation going forward, that's certainly one of the things that needs to be done. Because I'm just not sure how much further we can go out a parliamentary system that allows for these different value systems access relatively proportionately, allows them all access instead of them having to make out all these decisions at the beginning and then decide, okay, this is what the right's going to do, this is what the left's going to do, and then go forward. Yep. It's a horribly crude and just no longer functioning. I mean, there's no real reason for that right now. There was when you only basically had the left and the two-party system, fine. But now it's a three-party system. And if there's ever going to be integral, it would be a four-party.
Right. Yeah.
That won't fit.
Right.
Mathematics are all wrong. That's another to do is work on anything in the lines of belt. And that means if you happen to be a member of an ongoing religious institution, then start to talk to your minister, reverend, rabbi, preacher, whatever it is, about these types of topics. We're finding there's, particularly when it does come to things like the standard Christian tradition, we already have a lot of writers in the Christian tradition that are writing from orange and green, and they're writing extensive tracts on those. So there are people like Marcus or Shelby Bishop Spong. I mean, these are just brilliant writers. And I mean, Shelby Bishop, for example, will come flat out and say, I don't believe in a single myth in the Bible at all. I don't believe Christ was born from a biological virgin. I don't believe, he'll just go down the list. He's coming from a rational stage of spiritual intelligence. And so it's more of that type of orientation is required. Because again, remember, part of what we're talking about is how you get people in the left-hand quadrants moving more toward a position where they could find global world federation, something they wanted, or something they could see the importance of. I certainly think it's going to take at least 200 years, but steps need to be taken right now. From responding those two institutions, others are just on a very, very personal orientation yourself. So when's the last time you gave a copy of an integral book to anybody? So make an decide this Christmas you'll give a dozen copies, whoever the author is, but just start spreading the word. I mean, take on yourself. Totally. You can create local groups. If you have to be a parent, you can create local groups on parenting, on issues. You can do local groups on relationships and partnering. You can do any of these things to help people see that there are frameworks that are more embracing, that will make more sense of their issues, and will show them out of problems in a much more successful way. There's blog your head off about integral. I mean, whenever you run into a problem that you see happening in the world and you realize how a more integral approach happened, get on social media, spread it around. I mean, take some responsibility for that yourself. If you teach, make sure that as much as you can, you teach an equal version of your field. That makes a huge difference. There's probably in almost every department in every major university in this country, actually in the world, there's at least one or two people in every department who know something about an integral approach. They're probably having a hard time getting it through their departmental board, because if you have something like text ecology, spirituality, and you're teaching history, and you want to use that book as a text, and you let the local board, the local department's board look at it, almost the unanimous response would be, you can't this book. I mean, there's Saint Teresa of Avila. I mean, there's Zen Buddhism in there. You got to be kidding. Plotinus is in there.
Who's this Nagarjuna asshole?
Right. It's, it's gone. But also want to, where you work and talk with your colleagues and start to suggest any of the ways that more integral perspectives and approaches can make a big difference in those areas. These things tend to happen. We have, for example, or just even in this area, there's at least two major groups of integral physicians, and they've actually created themselves as an integral group medical approach. One of them was invited to the White House twice with ideas because they were looking so promising. And then one of the, in a sense, final, but still sort of most important ways is to just keep continuing studying yourself. I mean, the more you learn about integral, the more you think integrally, the more you think integrally, the more you behave integrally. And that's a crucially important point, because with all of these things that we're talking about, like generations and all of that, which is enormous, it still really is all dependent upon individuals moving themselves forward.
Yep.
It's that huge weight in 10 quadrants that ends up the motivating factor of those things in the right-hand quadrants that end up there and actually working. Part of that individual development is any organizations that you see attempting to address a problem, even something like the United Nations, they are constantly coming up with things like worldwide suggestions for development growth. And they've come up with, several of those. They were working for a decade or two on spiritual development goals. And they actually, for the particular book that's coming out, they asked me to write the talking about growing up, waking up, cleaning up, up, and how that change religion itself. The development of religions, which is part of the granddaddy of all of those organizations. And it's recently coming out, book that's actually divided into sections called Growing Up, Waking Up, Cleaning Up, Showing Up.
That's cool.
So these things have an impact. And anytime you can give some sort of feedback into those kinds of organizations, then that's going to end up helping as well. The overall drive is anything that a specific individual can do to help one or more other individuals understand a more integral approach to what they're doing. All comes down to that and how that changed. And each are responsible for that. And too often when people ask, what can I do? I fully understand this, but they're looking for sort of like big, dramatic changes that somehow snap your fingers and here it comes.
That's right.
That's how those things work. They work one person at a time.
Yep.
And it often doesn't take that many people if they have really good ideas. I keep reminding people that Paul Tillich said that what we call the Renaissance was participated in by about 1,000 people.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right.
Yep. 1,000 people who probably represented the plutocracy of that time. These were 1,000 elites.
There it is.
That's beautiful. Ken, thank you so much. And, I really appreciated your invitation to check out the people who find themselves differentiating themselves from the party that they used to identify pretty strongly with. And that's a phenomenon we are seeing on both sides. There's people who are also leaving the right. A lot of the moderate orange level Republicans are leaving George Will and Steve Schmidt and David Frum. And, a lot of which are, pretty neoconservative in their own sort of ideology, but they're leaving the GOP. It's not like they're becoming liberals. No. They just simply don't have anywhere else to go today.
I know, and they hate Trump so much, they just can't have anything to do with it. That's understandable.
Yeah.
But
yep.
Counterproductive.
And hopefully those are the voices who are going to, along with these sort of new emergences that we're seeing in conservatism, hopefully these are the guys who are actually going to be able to take their party back in a lot of ways and start steering this in the direction of a more world-centric conservatism, which again, I think the world needs now more than just about anything.
Right.
So Ken, thank you once again for all your time, for all your insight. This has been an awesome conversation. I look forward to getting in touch with you again next month. In the meantime, Merry Christmas, and we'll talk to everyone soon.
Okay.
Bye, guys.